This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Not so bad yourself. You got a smile on your face. What do you got for me today?
Well, I've always got something, right?
Something.
No, nothing crazy. Like, I've been spending a lot of time on the ID Pro Slack channel, not just today, but over the past couple of weeks. What a community, right? And the community kind of manifests in several places, but on a day-to-day basis, it's the ID Pro Slack channel. So I wanted to call out a few things that they've got going on right now. It's the public speaking workshops, which they're having sessions on how to become a better public speaker. And they're live sessions, so you probably have missed several already if you haven't been attending. But they are being recorded. So they're open to any ID Pro member. I mean, between the Slack channel and stuff like that, that pays for it right there. But also just all the things that are going on in the space, the skills survey, which unfortunately, I feel bad. We never, promoted the skills survey here on the podcast leading up. It's supposed to end on Thursday, February 29th.
Well, they're definitely going to hear that this time.
Yeah, but maybe it won't. It's scheduled to end there. And Heather Flanagan posted, like, it's scheduled to go till February 29th. But the way she worded it, I was like, it sounds like maybe you're going to extend it. So I'd say if you're an ID Pro member, get out there, check it out. Check out the speaker workshop. Of course, I think the Identiverse conference is like the home conference for ID Pro. So hopefully folks are going to Identiverse.
Yeah, I mean, we'll be there for sure. But yeah, I noticed those speaker workshop going on. They're very good. Heather Flanagan was on one. Sarah Cicchetti was on another one. Hers was great. Sarah does a lot of public speaking, so she's definitely one, if you're interested in getting this space, I think is a good one to kind of get into. Everyone has to find their own voice and their own style. And if you're not used to speaking in front of, many people, whatever many means to you, 500, 5,000, there's definitely a skill to it. It's not something that comes natural for me, for example. So I kind of have to work at it. And even though we do, the world famous Identity at the Center podcast with tens of thousands of listeners, for me, it's just, hey, I'm talking to you and I'm talking to our guests and I forget about the rest.
That's right. Yeah. And it's gotten easier over time. But I also just, being on the ID Pro Slack channel, also hearing, Heather's name, Sarah's name, and I don't want to try to go through the exhaustive list of everybody who makes this happen, right? But people volunteering their time to make ID Pro what it is, like, major shout out to those folks. And again, I don't want to try and name each person because I'm sure I'll leave too many folks off, and that's not a good feeling.
Pop quiz. Name every single member of ID Pro. Go.
Exactly. Well, I think there are 1,500 members now.
Yeah,
pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's great. And you're right. The Slack channel alone is worth the price of admission. Anything I get past that, I consider bonus. But I like to lurk through the Slack channels. Every once in a while, something come up, and I feel like I can provide my 2 cents on. But yeah, it's definitely worth it. If you got questions on anything, like ID Pro Slack is awesome, and people are very friendly. It's such a great industry to be in.
I like to ask the questions every once in a while to stir the pot. I threw a question out there about should there be, should people use their everyday accounts for administration, or should they have a secondary account for administration? Oh man, that's the new religious battle, right? It used to be how do you manage your contractors and stuff like that? So it's in that stack.
Yeah, I can see that. Very polarizing topic. I don't even want to figure out what's the right answer there. I don't know if there is a right answer. I think it's just what's the right answer for you, your organization, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, hey, you mentioned that we're going to be at Identiverse, and one of the things that we should mention is that we've got a 25% off discount code. It's the best discount code that should be floating around out there. So my pro tip would be try to use it as soon as possible while the pricing. I think it's like still early bird pricing.
Yeah, it's
I don't think
stacks.
that's going.
Use it. Abuse it.
Yeah, stat. Use a stat. IDV 24-IDAC 25. So IDV 24 is in the year, dash IDAC as in Identity at the Center 25. And we're going to put the link in the show notes, but it's events.identiverse.com/identiverse 2024/register, blah, 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 blah. Love the code.
I thought you were going to read the whole thing.
I was, when I saw the code, I was like, or the URL, I'm like, no, there's too much info stuffed into that URL.
When is Identiverse?
We should say about the conference?
Well, when is it?
Yeah, it's May 28th through the 31st, 2024. And guess where it's going to be?
Does it rhyme with Schmash?
Kind of.
Okay.
It's in Las Vegas.
That's what it might sound like after you've been there for a little while.
Yeah, right. If you don't control yourself, maybe that's all you'll be talking.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the cool things is that by going to the conference, you can earn up to 20 continuing education credits. If you're at a firm like we are, RSM, that requires that everybody to get a certain number of continuing education credits every year. I mean, 20 is a pretty good number for attending a conference.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so in terms of like why to attend over 4 days, 70 hours of thought-provoking panel discussions, top-notch keynotes, and hands-on masterclasses and trainings. Connect with more than 2,500 digital identity and security peers from around the world. And during the networking receptions and fun interactive group activities like boot camp, sunrise yoga, and more. Jeff, I bugged you about this last year. Are you going to go to the sunrise yoga?
I can unequivocally say hell no. And it's not what I'm about. If there was sunrise donuts or sunrise chicken and waffles, then yes. But yoga, no. I'm not about that.
Sunrise donuts. That sounds like a good business name.
There you go. Buy the domain name. Make sure you get that first.
Yeah, donut sounds good. And learn more about the latest innovations on the expo floor. That's it.
Yeah,
I've said enough.
Identiverse.com. Use our code. We'll have it in the show notes so people can check it out. But yeah, show support for the show. Use it. It stacks with the current early bird discounts. So 25% on top of whatever's currently out there. So hopefully people enjoy that. And we'll be there. So if you see us, come up. I'll be handing out fist bumps of gratitude. I had one person actually stop me last year. I know you get all the attention because you're usually wearing something that draws attention.
Oh, wait till you see the jacket that I bought. Boy,
I cannot wait for this.
Oh, man. That's why I love Amazon so much. I started going through. I'm like,
it's Amazon. Okay. All bets are off now.
Well, when you see this jacket, you're going to be like, whoa. You wait.
I don't know if whoa is what I'll say, but I'm sure it'll be a reaction of some sort.
Whoa is what you'll say.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll see it at another conference too, Identity Week. So we've partnered up with Identity Week for other conferences throughout this year. We've got Europe, which is in Amsterdam, June 11th to the 12th. America in Washington, D.C. That's where you and I will be at, September 11th and 12th. And then in Asia, Singapore, October 22nd and 23rd. We've got a code for that one as well, IDAC30. That gets you 30% off. We'll have links in our show notes for people to register in that. And that code actually works for all three conferences. So you don't have to be going to the American one if you're going to Asia or Europe conferences for Identity Week. Use that code, abuse it. I think it stacks probably as well with whatever discounts are currently out there. So again, we'll have a link in our show notes for both Identiverse and for Identity Week. And hopefully people are able to take advantage of those savings. Do we have anything else that we want to talk about before we get to our main topic of privacy?
Privacy is a fantastic topic. It has so much to do with identity. And if you're in this space long enough, you can't avoid it, even if you wanted to.
Yeah, you could try, but it's all around us. I feel like this is an area that we haven't talked too much about. So I'm very excited to welcome to the show Laura Gomez-Martin, Esquire. She's a former state chief privacy officer for the state of Maryland. And now she's a current colleague of ours at RSM. So we're able to get like this super smart people, way smarter than you and I, Jim, on the show. Welcome to the show, Laura.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here with you all.
So I think you're our first Esquire, which is a momentous occasion for us. I don't think we've had any other lawyers on, at least none that are at that level. you've started off, well, I want to hear about kind of how you started down this path, because chief privacy officer is not a historic, long-standing position for a lot of organizations. It's only recently, and when I say recently, probably within the last 10, maybe 20 years at most, where it's been an actual role within a lot of organizations. So I'd love to hear your story. How did you get to that state of chief privacy officer when you were at the state of Maryland? And then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, sure. So my journey there was quite long. It involves a little bit of training and a little bit of experience too. I was a professional student for about 9 years between my undergrad and graduate degrees. I did an undergrad in criminal justice, so not really related to privacy. And I wanted to go to law school. I wasn't sure what for, so I did a master's instead before, focused on cybersecurity policy. And then I went to law school to study intellectual property and technology law. And I took a privacy law class and just completely fell in love with it and figured that's what I really wanted to do. After I graduated and passed the bar, I ended up taking mostly what are called JD preferred positions. JD preferred positions are generally positions where they like that you're an attorney, but it's not necessary for you to be an attorney. The skill set that you bring to the table, though, in terms of negotiating, being able to read contractual language, to write contractual language, is really useful. So I ended up going into IT and cybersecurity consulting for a while. I did cybersecurity advisory work. And through that, I found myself as the deputy CISO for the Department of Information Technology within Maryland. And while I was there, I mostly focused on compliance and governance work. But unfortunately, there were a few incidents that occurred within the state that seemingly had privacy implications associated with them. And so increasingly, it was seen as an opportunity to grow that specific position within privacy. Our governor at the time, Governor Larry Hogan, found that data privacy and data protection was really a strong component of his goals. And so he created the state chief privacy position back in 2021, actually at the tail end of 2021. I was the first person to fill that role. And my role there was really to help all of the executive agencies within the state of Maryland to set strategy and policy for them, to coordinate with them on any incidents that occurred, to do some proactive work in terms of setting standardized contractual clauses and language, and do reactive work, unfortunately, if it came to that, and we were involved in any incidents.
That's a really awesome story. I love how you started out with 9 years as a professional student.
Yes.
But I mean, congratulations. Like, that's a really great career path. And it definitely would like to ask some questions before we close out relative to how somebody else could kind of follow a similar path, or maybe a totally different path to get to that chief privacy level, because I'm sure a lot of our listeners are interested or know people who are interested. But, I think you come from a unique perspective in that having that role in the public sector, I think people are asking the question in their mind, like, what is the role of the government in protecting privacy?
Yeah, so the role of the government really is kind of twofold. One, there's at the federal level, especially, there's certain agencies that are in charge of bringing to bear privacy litigation against companies and other government agencies. So, for example, the Federal Trade Commission does a lot of privacy litigation, mostly against private companies, but not always. And protecting consumer rights. Obviously, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau also has some privacy requirements specifically related to the financial industries and so on. So I think in terms of the one leg of government's role, it has a big role to play in enforcement of privacy and in making sure privacy awareness is out there. But on the other leg of it, government also plays a really important role in collecting data, right? So government offers a lot of services, some of which I call compulsory or they're mandated services. So you have birth certificates, things like death certificates, criminal justice records, which you can't get out of, right? And then there's optional services where if you work, you file taxes, you may own a home and file for some rent rebates or other rebates that you're eligible for. And through all of those services and the provisioning of all of those services, the government collects a lot of data on their constituents at all levels, right? So local, county, state, and federal. And so the government also plays a huge role in privacy in terms of needing to be mindful of just how much they're collecting, why they're collecting it, who they're ultimately sharing that data with, sister agencies and so on, third-party vendors if they use them, and contractors, and then being mindful of how long they keep that data as well.
So I was thinking, Laura, that there's probably then a third leg of the stool, right, which is creating new privacy legislation. And not every governmental body seems to want to do that. And maybe that's a good thing because we're already getting this kind of scattered approach to privacy regulation. I mean, everybody who's listening to the podcast probably are at some level familiar with GDPR, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe that's because it's it's been around the longest, it's the most famous, it's the most comprehensive, but it hasn't stopped there, right? So maybe you can help us kind of do we want to look at this from a history perspective, or just is there a better way to understand the current landscape in terms of the regulatory landscape of privacy?
Yeah, so I think Jeff mentioned it earlier, but privacy has become a hotter topic as of late, but it's really kicked off about maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Privacy used to be very industry specific, meaning it really depended on if you were dealing with healthcare information, federal tax information, criminal justice records. You had to deal with very specific and niche type of data to be subject to a lot of privacy regulations historically. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. Jim, to your point, there's regulations popping up all the time internationally and within the states. So in terms of internationally, of course, most people know the GDPR pretty well, but there are a lot of other patchwork regulations worldwide, and all over the continents. So we need to be really educating ourselves and being mindful of where businesses operate, even where their employees are, because a lot of times these regulations tie to the physical location of personnel, not necessarily their citizenship or their residency. And so being mindful of that is something that's increasingly important. And of course, in the United States specifically, we are at the point where right now we have about 13 states that have privacy laws on the books already. And that's an increase up from about 7 just the previous year. So we went from 7 to 13, and then there's 17 more states right now that actually have privacy legislations currently, or have privacy legislations and statutes currently going through their legislative process. So you can imagine that creates a huge influx of regulations and some patchwork that needs to be accounted for, especially if an organization or a company operates on a national level and within various states. So there are thankfully some central tenets and some central best practices that are found throughout all of those laws, but there are nuances here and there, and those are the pieces you really want to be paying attention to closely as you move forward.
Yeah, it's so complex, and what I'd like to eventually get to is what advice would you have for IAM practitioners like Jeff and I, and most of the listeners of this podcast, frankly, people who are trying to take this complex, I think you used a great word, like patchwork, or it's like a quilt of different regulations all over the world. And you mentioned national companies. What about international companies? Or, so now they've got GDPR and potentially all these state regulations, and maybe there are other privacy regulations outside the US that affect them. What is your advice? I guess I'm presupposing in my mind that what you're going to say is like, take the most restrictive from anywhere that you operate and like try to live by that. But I think in a lot of ways that could be like really difficult to do. And it's like, okay, that sounds like a good approach, but is it realistic?
Yeah, so I think my main advice would be you never want to move so fast that you are moving faster than these laws. And because they are coming up all of the time, you do want to make sure that you operate, of course, to sustain a business, but you want to be mindful that these laws exist and you don't want to run afoul of them, especially laws like the GDPR in Europe, where there's been multiple suits already against companies. You want to be protecting yourself as much as possible, mindful of the restrictions and the consent orders that you need to put in place and get proper permission from your customers. But the main thing is you always want to do right by your customers and the people you serve. And so really in terms of advice for companies dealing with that global privacy regulation, it's being aware of what your operations are. And I'll say this, even business to business operations require some knowledge and some implementation of privacy standards, because even if you're selling to other businesses and other corporations, you have employees and you have their personal identifiable information. And so you may share, for instance, when you're hiring somebody, you may share their resume, you may share their background for background investigation purposes, drug screening, and so on with third-party vendors. And so even though they are not a customer of your organization, they are still somebody you need to be mindful of in terms of privacy practices. So that's where I try to highlight that you need to be not only thinking of your operations, but also where your employees are, where they're located, and keep that in mind as you move forward in terms of privacy. There are a lot of organizations who on the surface may think, well, I don't really handle any PII data. I sell gadgets and gizmos. I don't know what that has to do with anything. And but that's not true. Privacy matters to all companies.
One thing I've seen identity practitioners not be confident in answering is questions around data residency. And so what I mean by that is, okay, we're implementing a Workday solution. Do we need to have a Workday in each one of the locations because this data about employees can't leave the boundaries of the EU or maybe China or something like that? And so what kind of advice would you give when it comes to that?
Sure. So I'm going to give a very Esquire type of answer here, Jim, but the answer is it depends. And the reality is some of these regulations on the surface require things like the prohibition of cross-border data transfers and so on, or require certain data hosting locations. And then aside from the regulations, there's also contractual regulations. So you may enter into third-party agreements or vendor contracts where whoever you're partnering with or whoever you're using services from requires you to limit where that data can go and who that data can be shared with. And that's also another thing to keep in mind as you enter contractual arrangements with other vendors and companies is what privacy requirements do they have? And does that flow to you by virtue of partnering with them as a result?
It seems like there's a lot of companies that make their privacy policies intentionally long and complex. I think back to like EULAs, everyone's favorite thing, right? Scroll, 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 accept. Right?
Yes.
Did I read it? No. And there's stories, right, of, hey, if you find this text, you got like a huge discount or free car, or you sold your soul right to somebody. Why is that? I mean, it feels like it's so filled with legal speak, and you're you're a lawyer, so I'm going to put this to you. Is like, why can't these be, I guess, more readable? It's almost like they don't want you to read them. Am I crazy for trying to be a normal human being and read something that I hope that I can understand? Or is there a reason why they have to be this complex? I guess, what would you like to see in the space?
Yeah. So I would love to see shorter, more user-friendly, maybe even graphical consent and permissions, something that's in plain language and uses plain language policies or plain English policies. However, a central tenet of privacy really is to get a user's informed consent. And obviously, Jeff, to your point, when these privacy policies are long and lengthy and they don't really encourage or empower somebody to read through the whole thing, how much informed consent can you be giving in that case? But many companies, unfortunately, create these lengthier, more vague policies and in an effort to really accommodate to future use of the data that they're collecting. And what I mean by that is if they were too prescriptive and concise in their privacy language in limiting and listing out, for instance, we're only sharing it with these specific 3 partners, and we're only doing it for very specific ABC type of purposes, it limits their ability to perhaps find a different partnership next year that they can use that data for. And so because of that, these lengthier policies end up using very vague language. For instance, we can use your data for research purposes, but it doesn't actually tell you what type of research purposes or who they're going to be sharing that with. It will say that they are able to share it with third-party vendors or third-party service providers, but it doesn't necessarily spell out who. And that's vague enough so that it can accommodate any new partnerships they have, any new ways that they can leverage that data and cross-sell it or use it for other marketing purposes and so on. And so there's really a balance to strike between getting the information and being able to use that information as a company, but also being careful to be mindful of the customers you're serving and what their agreement probably was when they signed on to that permission.
I want to go back to something you mentioned about informed consent. If I came to a lawyer, and this is not legal advice, don't come to Identity Center for legal advice. First of all, let me put that out there. But if I came to somebody and said, look, they threw 45 pages of legalese at me, and all I wanted to do was share a photo with my grandma or something like that. Would I have a case that says, you guys made it, like the company made it too obtuse for me to be able to understand as a normal language? Would I have a case to say, that's not really informed consent? It's a bunch of legal jargon thrown at me to protect all the different use cases. And the way you described it, very simple, right? Why didn't you just write that rather than 45 pages of legal? Would I have a case to say that's not really informed consent? Because no normal person who isn't a trained lawyer is going to be able to decipher what all these clauses and statements and if-then statements that come through it, right? That may be there.
Yeah, so I hate to speculate on
I'm not
somebody's...
I don't want to get you in trouble. Again, this is not legal advice. I'm just, like, it seems crazy to me. It's like, oh, you're expected to be able to understand all this, but I don't know if that's necessarily a fair ask from the company who's presenting you all this information.
Right, yeah. Well, I'll say this. I don't think as an attorney, you would say, I don't think I know enough about the facts to speak on the legality of somebody standing on that. But I think the companies do have to strike the right balance. And as privacy becomes a hotter topic, within the last couple of years and into the next few years and hopefully decades to come, I believe companies that emphasize privacy will say that and focus on treating their customers ethically will be rewarded with higher customer retention and satisfaction moving forward. So being mindful, doing right by your customers, I think will go a long way.
I feel like, Jeff, one of your famous lines is, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product.
Yes.
I heard there was a social media company, and we won't name names, but that in their privacy policy, it essentially said, if you upload a picture or something, it's now their property. So could you imagine uploading that picture with your grandkids, and then you see it on the billboard, like, come use our site, look how happy our users are. I mean, that's real damages as far as I'm concerned, right? I'm not a lawyer, so I'm gonna go out there and say that's damages. That's a violation of privacy, right? And if somebody doesn't read 44 pages of mumbo jumbo, to me, it's kind of like when you go to a grocery store and they have a sign like, if our carts hit your car, it's not our fault. Like, just because you say it's not your fault doesn't mean it's not your fault. Your property damaged my property. So that's my opinion, right? As a non-Esquire, we have never had an Esquire on the show, and Jeff, you and I have been on every show. So take that with a grain of salt. But here's what I wanted to throw out there, Laura, because I've had this idea. It's kind of a crazy idea, but I want to throw it out there. So my idea was, what if there were certain categories of privacy policy, like privacy policy A, privacy policy B, privacy policy C? So you could get to know at a high level what A, B, and C were. And then if a company said, we use privacy policy B, say, oh, okay, I know what B is. And I'm willing to give you access to B. Or is that way too simple?
So I think the danger with that is that it does seem to overly simplify the complexity sometimes of these data sharing agreements that these companies have, and the resourcing and the outsourcing that they do to third-party service providers, for instance, who may host their data or who they use as managed service providers for IT support and so on. And so depending, some companies want to do all of that in-house, and some companies outsource it, and some companies do some outsourcing and some in-house combinations of services. And so because every company really would be providing different services and using different vendors, I think it would be really hard to do that in terms of having a privacy ABC type of policy. But I don't think it's an unreasonable ask for companies to start simplifying the privacy policies that they do have, and just making sure that they are communicating clearly and effectively and openly to their customers that this is exactly what we're doing with your data. Any deviation from this will require us to reach out to you for further consent moving forward.
So you handled our soapbox version very well. I'm going to get off of that, but I want to talk about expectations. Are there differences in expectations between public and private companies? I guess what is the difference there that you see when it comes to the expectation of privacy?
The expectation, sorry, Jeff, just to clarify, between private companies and non-private companies?
Yeah, so it could be private, could be non-private, it could be government. Are there, I guess, the different levels of expectations that might be that, oh, I thought this was private, but it's not really, or maybe things that are well known, the opposite, right? Something like that. I guess I'm just trying to understand what are the different expectations between them.
Yeah, sure. So I think the best way to kind of summarize the difference in expectations is probably the difference that I think the consumer or the user of the product or services actually feels when they're engaging with different types of companies and entities, which is oftentimes when a person is interacting with a government agency, for instance, they don't tend to think that government agency is doing analytical research on their data that they're gathering from constituents. They don't tend to think that they are partnering with other sister agencies and sharing that data. So I think the assumption from the public when interacting with something like a government entity is that they keep all of that information in-house. And while that may be true at some agencies, at a lot of agencies, they do share data with one another in terms of identifying people, making sure that people are not behind on certain payments and requirements that they are legally obligated to abide to, and so on, to receive public services. And so when it comes to private companies, especially to Jim's point earlier, where if you're not paying for the service, you are the product. I think a lot of people are under the assumption that that is the case, that if you're not paying for a service, you are somehow providing them some benefit via your data, whether that's selling it, doing analytics on it, opening yourself up to marketing emails, and so on. So I think that's really the difference in expectations, is what the consumer themselves thinks is happening. But the reality is companies, nonprofits, government agencies, all of them share data to a certain extent. And so that's why privacy policies and privacy rights are really increasingly important.
So we've been kind of talking about it here, but social media, I would imagine, we talk about being the product. I feel like that's a prime example of that. Now, you can make the argument, it's like, yeah, it's great. I'm able to have conversations on X social media platform with people that I wouldn't normally be talking with, or I stay in contact with. But I'm trading that ease of use or that functionality for something. What are some of the concerns that social media brings to the table when it comes to privacy?
Sure. So I would say not only social media, but even just apps in general. I think some of the concerns that are brought up with that are really things like intrusive access or additional access than what's necessary for that app to function or that social media platform to function. So, for instance, if you download something, I had this happen, this was a long time ago, but I downloaded a flashlight app. This was before smartphones came with flashlight apps. And I downloaded a flashlight app, and it said, you grant this app the ability to read your text messages. And I thought to myself, why do they need to read my text messages just for a flashlight function on my phone? So there's things that come up even now, where social media platforms or apps they try to bite off a little bit more than maybe what's necessary for them to have access to. They also have the excessive privacy and lengthy privacy policies that we were talking about earlier, where people just accept and agree to share, or perhaps even, to Jim's point, give up some ownership of what they upload to that platform. And another concern is really in terms of unnecessary or excessive marketing and sharing of your information, which is you may sign up for a social media platform or an application, and suddenly you start getting emails from a lot of other companies who you've never interacted with. You don't know how they got your information. I actually get this quite often, even through snail mail. So I'll get ads, or I'll get magazines that I did not subscribe to, and I have no idea. I've never visited that company's website. I've never been anywhere near that magazine, so I'm not sure how it came to be in my mailbox. And so things like that are always concerning. Just how did you get my information? And please take me off your list.
Yeah, it seems like all this traces back to that comment I think that you started with, which is the context matters. Like it depends, which makes you not only a great lawyer but a great consultant as well. But I even think like the context of you as private citizen versus you as an employee of a company. So the context of who you're dealing with, whether it's government or your employer or some private company they have a relationship with for maybe a credit card, or some company that came up with a flashlight app, which is really, potentially just trying to get your data so they can sell it, which,
Right.
or read your text messages. That's super creepy. Anyway, you mentioned that you have a cybersecurity background. So really a privacy person to the core, Esquire, but also a cybersecurity background. So I'm imagining that is helpful when it comes to what you're doing now. The thing that came to mind was, how I think it's GDPR really caused this, which is every website you go to now is like, the first thing you have to do is like you accept their cookie policy. I don't know how that makes anything better because like every single site requires you to accept their cookie policy. If you don't accept cookies, you're not going anywhere on the web.
Yes. Yeah. So in terms of cybersecurity and how that's been helpful to me is I think it provides a lot more context around the fact patterns and the incidents or the situations that I encounter with customers and clients before and now the clients that I serve as a consultant. But privacy and cybersecurity are really what I like to say two sides of the same coin. They're very complementary to each other. In my mind, the Venn diagram between them really overlaps. I wouldn't say it's a complete circle, but there's a lot of overlap between the two topics. And so in terms of a question I get asked quite often is, what is the difference between cybersecurity and privacy? Especially when I became the state chief privacy officer, I got this question a lot from friends and family asking, I thought you were doing that before as a deputy CISO. And the reality is they're connected, but they're not quite the same. So the way I think of cybersecurity is once you have the data and the infrastructure in place, what controls are you putting in place to make sure that you are locking that data down, being mindful of the sensitivity of the data, and et cetera. Privacy, to your point on cookies, is more front-loaded in terms of actually gathering the data, making sure that you're only collecting that data which you need. You're not being overly prescriptive in what you can collect from your customers and consumers of your services or products, and being mindful to put in place retention policies. Data gets deleted after X number of months or years, or when it's no longer useful to the company or the entity. And cyber and privacy really have to work together a lot to make sure that privacy considerations are taken into the fold when cybersecurity parameters and controls are being established, and vice versa. So, cybersecurity then reaches back out to privacy a lot, perhaps during incidents. Unfortunately, if there's implications that some PII or some very sensitive information was affected in that incident.
So as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I think that there's got to be so many of our listeners out there who are interested in a career in privacy and, hear your story and would love some advice in terms of how do they get into this exciting field and move to a senior leadership position. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, so I think my main advice would probably be that they should do lots of learning and reading. They don't necessarily need to be an Esquire. There are quite a bit of chief privacy officers that are attorneys or were attorneys at one point in their careers, but it's not necessary. I think more so what you need is the ability to read, articulate, write, concise language, work on compliance and governance issues, and really be mindful of consumer protection. So privacy to me is really an extension of consumer protection. It's making sure that companies are doing right by their customers and their clients, that ultimately those customers have the right to be able to interact with that company and ask them what type of data do you have on me? How is it shared? Limit perhaps that company's data that they have on them, be able to request deletions or corrections and so on, and just be open and honest with those people that are using their services or buying their products. So I think the best advice I would say for somebody starting a career in privacy is to make sure that you are passionate about constantly learning. To our points earlier with the patchwork quilt of regulations in place, and it's constantly growing day to day, month to month, and year to year. You really need to be mindful that what you know today, it could change in 2 months, and you're going to have to keep up with all of that to keep pace.
Wanted to wrap up with kind of a funner question. I don't know how fun this is, but we always love to talk about AI and deep fakes, and it's kind of like cutting edge. I don't think there's anyone who knows for sure how this is going to play out, but wondering what your level of concern or how you think about AI deep fakes and how it's going to affect privacy. And, even like, I think there's a low tech version of that, which is identity theft, right? And that kind of all feels like it's part of your Venn diagram. Where does identity and privacy overlap? Identity theft is definitely in that intersection. But what about the AI and deepfakes? Where's your head at with that?
Yeah, so the AI deepfakes, the biggest threat really is to data protection and proprietary information. And we've seen this, even before AI deepfakes became a thing, which is, targeted social engineering campaigns by criminals to try to get finances moved around within corporations, get some proprietary information that they wouldn't be privy to otherwise. And things like, for instance, AI voice cloning is really concerning to me, that somebody would be able to call someone they work very intimately with day to day and clone someone else's voice, their business partner, their boss, somebody within their organization, and make a believable argument that they should transfer funds or they should close an account and so on, grant excessive permissions to somebody that either doesn't exist within the organization or shouldn't have those permissions. That's all really concerning. And I think what is most concerning about it is that I don't think companies are quite keeping up with training their staff adequately to accommodate for these new situations that are going to be occurring, that have occurred and will be occurring increasingly in the future, meaning a lot of us have been through cybersecurity training, perhaps. Some of us are probably subjected to the phishing emails that you get as testing to make sure that you recognize phishing emails and report them adequately. But it's also very important to train your staff on these AI deepfakes that exist and have them also be mindful that they may get a phone call, they may get a text message, they might get a voicemail from someone who it's not actually who they think they're talking to. And so being able to really educate your staff and your employees on that and protect your organization is really important. You also mentioned identity theft, I think, Jim, right? And so I think a really big concern there is just how does somebody prove that it wasn't them, which can be hard to do. So for instance, when you call certain service providers or certain vendors, you get the standard, this phone call will be recorded. And it's going to be very hard at times for somebody to prove that that's not actually me talking, even though it sounds exactly like me. And so I think we'll see that moving forward too.
I find that interesting that you kind of flipped it where I thought you would go is, how do you prove that someone is yourself, that you are you? Now we're talking about how do you prove that wasn't you?
Yeah.
I mean, you always feel like we're caught between a rock and a hard place here, where it's like, okay, we have to be concerned about if I call in somebody, historically in the US, at least they'd ask for the last four of your social number, which should never have been used that way, but too late. That's how the cat's out of the bag. And now it's, well, I called and that wasn't me. Well, prove it. Like, how are you supposed to prove? I mean, it's like, you're gonna have to, like, I feel like it's such a difficult balance that we need to strike here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's not something that we want to have to do, but I think it's something that we're increasingly going to have to think about.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you being part of this and our shenanigans. I want to end on a lighter note, and I got to weave privacy into that because just this is how we roll here. You're also a mother of 2 boys. What's the most surprising thing your boys have taught you about privacy?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think the most surprising thing my boys have taught me about privacy, my boys are still quite young, so they're not on tablets, they're not on cell phones or anything like that. But I think even now that they're preschool age, what they've taught me is to set boundaries with people in my life. And what I mean by that is I live in the United States. A lot of my family is overseas, and they use Facebook quite frequently to communicate with me or to see updates or photos of my children. And what I've learned is that there's times where I've had to set boundaries with family members because I'm very mindful of my privacy permissions on certain platforms. But other people may not be. And so they can download pictures, upload pictures, and perhaps they don't have as restrictive of permissions as I do. And so I think that's something important to keep in mind, not only for myself, but I think for listeners as well, to make sure that it's not just about what you're sharing, it's about what people around you can share about you as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not the same story, but I hate when my wife posts a picture of me on Facebook. Like, no, like, stop it. Don't do that. I just don't want to be on there. Jim, you've got a couple boys. Have they taught you anything about privacy?
Yeah, and mine are teenagers. I have a little bit of a twist on this, which is that I've gone through various stages with my kids. And one of the stages was they were playing Little League baseball. And the people who run our Little League are honest people. So I don't want this to reflect on them. But their website technology was like, they had like their homemade website, and it was like, come in, create a profile, put all your private data in it, and then, submit. Here's the thing. This is what really bothered me about the whole thing. It's like, this database is getting cracked, right? And all this data is ending up on the dark web. So you try to pick some password that definitely, if it ended up on the dark web, wouldn't allow somebody to get into something important, right? But also, you just know all that data is just, I know that. Most people don't know that, but like, there's almost like a guarantee. But the thing that bothered me about it was like, either fill this information out or don't let your kid play Little League baseball. Those are your choices. And I was like, man, then because if it wasn't for the kids to go do something that they wanted to do, I'd have been like, sorry, you're not getting my data. So, I don't know if that's what my kids taught me, but I would not have been in that situation otherwise. So there you go. That's my story. What about you, Jeff?
Well, I don't have kids, but I take my personal privacy, very seriously. I don't want my data out there either. So I can't add anything on the child front, but I got a follow-up question for you, Jim. Do your kids, now that they're older, and Laura, it'd be interesting to see how maybe yours progress as they get older, but do they think about the privacy implications of the services that they're using? Or do they just sign up for stuff?
I don't think so. And I think my 16-year-old is just constantly on social media, like just all the time. Now, I've noticed with my older son, he seems to be less and less absorbed in it, which I'm hoping happens with my younger boy too, because little story, I took my younger son to a college baseball game at Clemson this weekend. And I was looking around, and like the people who are in college, they weren't like sitting there like glued eyeballs on their phone the whole time. They were talking with their friends and interacting, having a good time. So I think the hope for me is that they grow out of it a little bit. And my personal feeling is like, I think it's like destructive to society overall. Having people like with their eyeballs glued to their devices all the time and like living on social media. And I think especially for young kids that, you know, there's so much cyberbullying going on. Like as a parent, it scares you, but you know, other than having like some kind of net nanny software that you can spy on them 24 hours a day, how would you even know it's happening? And so, yes, that very much concerns me.
Or do you want to add anything to that? Or you
later note?
I can't wait to get to that later on down the road. We'll punt.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I go back and forth on, I get asked a lot, well, at what age are your kids going to get cell phones? And yeah, I go back and forth on saying never or when they move out of my house. And the functional use of a cell phone, which is when they're out of your sight and if there's an emergency, they can reach you. And so that balancing act is a hard thing to strike. The proper permissions and use and going a little bit too far, opening them up to being able to be bullied at all hours or even messaged at all hours, even nice messages from friends. Do they really need to do that all day long? And so on. But I do want to touch on something that Jim mentioned, which is that his children would not have been allowed to play that sport unless he gave that information up. And that's something I try to be really mindful of. As with the flashlight example that I mentioned earlier, is why do you need this information? There's information you might need for my son to be able to play baseball, such as his age, because you want to make sure he's on the right team, or shoe size, or uniform size or glove size, and so on. But there's other information that's probably not necessary for me to provide. It's one thing for you to know the school district he's at. It's another thing for you to know his student ID, or God forbid his social security number, or me to have his birth certificate on file, and so on. There's just things you need for certain services and products and things that you don't. And so I think that's important for individuals to keep in mind as they move forward using products and services and companies. But it's also something for companies and entities to keep in mind as they build out processes and just making sure that they're limiting what they're asking and really only asking for that which they need.
I think that's great advice. I don't know if we can end on a better note than that, so we'll probably leave it there. Laura, thank you so much for being part of this. It's great working with you and having you on the show and being able to bring your expertise. I'm sure there will be privacy things that come up, and I'm going to nominate you to be our reporter in the field for privacy things and come back and, if you're willing, talk to us about things that might be changing, in the world or the US or whatever it may be that folks in our space should be cognizant of. So thank you so much for taking the time with us. We'll leave it there. We're on the web, idacpodcast.com, Twitter, X, whatever it's called when you listen to this, at IDAC Podcast. Mastodon, I don't want to forget that. Jim got on me last time about not mentioning Mastodon. At IDAC Podcast, at infosec.exchange. We're on LinkedIn. We'll have links in our show notes. You can connect with Jim, Laura, myself, if you've got questions about anything that came up. And like, subscribe, do all that stuff, share it with a friend. We continue to grow, which is awesome. Be sure to use our conference discount codes, and we hope to see you at Identity Week and at Identiverse later this year. So thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com and find us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. See you next time on Identity at the Center.